And so our first speaker will be Elizabeth Neumann. Elizabeth was the White House Homeland Security Council. She worked for the White House Homeland Security Council during the George W. Bush administration and was also Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism in the Department of Homeland Security during the Trump administration. Her recent book is Kingdom of Rage, The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. We're going to be doing some giveaways later, and so that we also have some signed copies, and you'll also be able to buy all these books out in the foyer as well. And she's also Chief Strategy Officer for Moonshot and a national security contributor for ABC News. Please welcome Elizabeth Neumann.
Good morning. Let's see. You can hear me, right? All right, that's great. I can hear myself now. That's great. I'm delighted to be with you today. I want to thank Knapp and Pastor Vince and the Outlet team. Jennifer, it's really a privilege to be able to spend time with you today and to learn from you. I actually have Georgia roots. I was born in Columbus, Georgia. Now, I didn't spend too much time here. I was here for about 18 months before we moved back to Dallas, but my husband comes from Stockbridge, Georgia, if anybody knows where that is, down south of the airport. But I want to share a little bit more about my background just to give some context beyond what Knapp shared. I'm a Christian by background. I was raised in a Christian family, went to a Christian school, Bible Belt, Dallas, Texas, so think Dallas Theological Seminary influence. And then after college, I went to Washington, D.C. I spent most of my adult life in Washington, D.C., but my husband's job moved us around. We were, I want to say, 6 moves in 15 years, so 5 different states, 6 cities. So I have been in SBC, PCA, Acts 29, non-denominational, PCUSA, EPC, I'm sure I'm leaving something out, Anglican churches over the last 15 years. Which sometimes leaves something to be desired because you lack those deeper roots in a church community. But I do think maybe help prepare me for the moment that we find ourselves in and certainly build some protective factors for me, and that's a term we'll talk about here in a second, to build resilience to some of the things that have taken place in our churches. So I call myself an evangelical mutt. And that's a little context for you as we dive into some of the substance. If we could flip on to the slides, that's great. So I just want to point out, I'm starting with a picture of a forest fire. I live out west now in Denver. They're quite devastating and sometimes completely uncontrollable. And I think there's a metaphor there for us and what we're experiencing, and I'll pick that up at the end. Could we go to the next slide? Our agenda for today, I'm going to spend about 40 minutes unpacking a lot of different topics and hopefully preserve some time for us to be able to take some questions as well. My objective is to equip you with an understanding of the dangers of polarization, how it leads to an increased acts of violence and results in a downward cycle, a decline of society as a whole. We're going to look at topics like extremism, radicalization, why people radicalize, what to do, how we can intervene with them. But most importantly, we're going to look at what the church can do in that space. It's a ton of material, so much so that I wrote an entire book. Actually, I wrote 2 books, but my editor made me cut it down to 1 book. So there's a lot here, and we could go a lot of different places. I'm trusting that the Lord will guide me and guide the questions that you all have to make this time the most beneficial to you. But before we go deeper on these topics, which can be a little weighty and scary, I want to be clear that I appreciate, for those of you that are in pastoral leadership or are leading in your church, that your calling is primary to be a minister of the word and to make disciples of Jesus. So though I can get quite passionate about protecting our country and preventing violence, your calling is primary, and I am not suggesting that you need to take on my calling as a security professional. But I do hope that by sharing a little bit about my calling, that might help you see that you actually have some unique opportunities to help our broader community become a safer place, become a place of flourishing. Okay, next slide. Good news first. I think we're going to talk about some dark stuff, and I want to have this in the back of your mind before we go there. I do think that the church is truly well suited for this moment. I think that there is nothing new under the sun. So though it feels quite devastating to us, the broken relationships, the intractable problems that we face, the saints that have gone before us have lived through so much worse than this, and we can take great comfort in that. The third thing I want to leave you with is that the research on radicalization and extremism has demonstrated we can actually build resilience. And in what I hope to be able to show you, in what we have as a church and what Jesus has to offer, that resilience is something that the community can offer, the church can offer to our broader community. I think you already have the tools, is my point. I just want to connect dots for you so you can feel a little bit more empowered to go out and use those tools. Okay, well, next slide. I don't know if you can see all of that back there. Can most of you see it? No, okay. Those are pictures of the newspapers on September 12, 2001. I was in Washington, D.C. that day. I was working at the office or the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It was a frightening day. I was young, and all I knew is that everybody just decided we got to get out of the city as fast as possible. I happened to have driven to the work that day, and the moment we started seeing smoke come up from the Pentagon, it was like, let's get out of here. So we packed into my little hatchback, and what should have been a 15-minute drive home took 6 hours. So maybe trying to get out of the city was not the right call, but that was just instinct, right? You got to find a way to get safe. And there was this moment as we were driving down Independence Avenue, really kind of crawling down Independence Avenue. People were walking faster than we were driving. There was a part in the buildings, and you could see in the rearview mirror that the Capitol was there. And I remember thinking, oh, good, it's still there. Because at the time, one, our communications were much worse than they are today. So we were totally reliant on radio only. Cell phone coverage was down. We thought there were still planes in the sky. And if you've ever flown into Washington, D.C., the two most prominent landmarks are the Washington Monument and the U.S. Capitol. So if you're going to slam a plane into someplace, why wouldn't you choose the Capitol? So we just assumed. And we weren't wrong in that assumption. We now know that Flight 93 was destined for the U.S. Capitol, and but for the brave men and women who stormed the cockpit and crashed that plane in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, we wouldn't still have that Capitol. So that was a pretty life-changing moment for me and many of my generation. I decided I would do whatever I could for the foreseeable future to make sure that America would never have such a dark day again. And I had the opportunity to eventually join the White House Homeland Security Council, learn from some amazing people, and I've been doing it ever since. And then January 6th happened. And as a counterterrorism person, January 6th was an utter failure of our security system. We spent 20 years, trillions of dollars, lots of training, lots of policy papers. That's what I do. I do the policy side. And we didn't see that coming. Next slide. So I want to share a little bit about this changing threat so that you can kind of maybe have a better appreciation for the challenges we face. I think putting it into context of what we were dealing with post 9/11, at least for those of us old enough to remember it, might help us make sense why today is so much more challenging. So back then, we were very worried about a complex coordinated attack. And some of these pictures are scenes of those early days. So we now have TSA. We didn't have TSA before. We now have a joint terrorism task force. That's an FBI coordinated body that there's, I want to say, over 110 of them across the country. We have the National Counterterrorism Center, the Terrorist Screening Center. We have all of these scenes post 9/11, and they're all designed to help us find the dots of a plot and connect those dots so that we can disrupt the plot. Those types of plots took months, if not years, to plan, and they had lots of opportunities for law enforcement, military, and intelligence to detect those dots, and lots of time for analysts to start plotting them on a map and putting them together. So consequently, those early post 9/11 days were the mission of military intelligence and law enforcement. What I want to show you today is that those tools are necessary but not sufficient for today's threat, in part because we didn't fully understand why people radicalized, so our definition of prevention was pretty narrow at that point, but it's also because the threat has changed as well. It took a decade, really into 2011, 2012, before what you would consider today's current counterterrorism apparatus really matured into what it is. But we're really quite good at preventing people from overseas that want to do us harm from getting here. So I'm not diminishing that important work, and it still has to keep going because there are still threats out there. But what we didn't anticipate and we didn't adapt to well was, with the rise of the internet, the ability to radicalize our own people. And we first started noticing it with ISIS. ISIS originally tried to recruit people to come overseas to the Middle East to join the caliphate. And then when they were militarily getting defeated, they said, no, don't come here anymore. Just stay where you are. And they literally built a model of bring your own weapon to the fight. And so you had these knife attacks in Europe because they don't have guns as prevalent as we do. You had vehicle ramming attacks in both our countries. And then here it's primarily guns. People just grab what they could. It would be one, maybe two people, and they would commit a pretty heinous act. And we call those homegrown violent extremists. They're US citizens or people that are based here, inspired by ISIS, but not directed by. So a different type of threat. Next slide, please. The other part of the change of threat was actually maybe not a change at all, but rather a weakness in the counterterrorism community's ability to see the threat. And that is the threat from within, from what we call domestic terrorism. If there are lawyers here, we can talk later about the nuances here. But broadly speaking, international terrorism is Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So it's an organized group of people that live overseas, and we can designate them as a terrorist group. The law allows us to do that. You could, hypothetically, have a similar ideology to ISIS if you are located in the United States and form your group, and don't pledge allegiance to those other groups. As long as you don't pledge allegiance to those groups, if you are in the United States and organize yourself around, doesn't matter the ideology, just something extremist, we can't designate you, and you are considered a domestic terrorist organization. Now, that gets confusing because when the federal government talks about domestic terrorism, they actually do talk about different ideologies. And predominantly, those ideologies are not related to Salafi jihadism. And so we tend to think international is the Islamic threat and domestic is the white supremacist threat. And that's not actually how the law treats it. It has to do with whether you are located in the United States or not. Next slide. Part of the challenge with that, of course, is if you are committing an attack in the name of ISIS and you do something here in the United States, we can arrest you because you did it in the name of ISIS. And you could do the same action in the name of a neo-Nazi group that's based here in the United States, and the law doesn't apply the same to that neo-Nazi group. We can't arrest you for quite the same things. Now, eventually you do something criminal, we can. But just being associated with a foreign terrorist group gives law enforcement a ton of authority that we can't apply in the domestic terrorism space. So, counterterrorism community predominantly focused on international threats. Al-Qaeda, ISIS totally makes sense. 9/11 was devastating. You know, we want to make sure that never happens again. And we totally miss that actually we have more deaths, attacks, plots coming from within. So these slides, which are, for those of you in the back, probably going to be too small. Let me talk through a few things. On the top right, it's the U.S. terrorist attacks and plots and fatalities, 1994 to 2021. This comes from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. And what they've done is plotted, and you can kind of see on there are two spikes, one in 94, one in 2001. Those are the Oklahoma City bombing and the 9/11 attacks. So those are our outliers in terms of deaths. But if you take those outliers out, what you see is that the water level is higher in the 90s, kind of dips down after 9/11, and then shoots up starting in around 2015. That's the main thing I want you to see there. Now let's look at the main graph, U.S. terrorist attacks and plots by perpetrator orientation. And you see there's colors there. The red is your Al-Qaeda ISIS threat. Your green is left-wing violent extremism. There is a tiny color of purple that kind of blips up from the bottom. That's ethno-nationalist. In the United States, the only coded ethno-nationalist is actually Cuban or Puerto Rican independence movements. So very small there. The blue is violent far right. I told you the government and think tanks use different terminology. Violent far right is not something the government would call, would not use that label, but the violent far right is predominantly white supremacist extremism and militia violent extremism. So what I want you to see here is on the left side of the graph in 1994, we have a high water mark for the violent far right. Post 9/11, it drops. We unify as a country when we have a common external enemy. And then beginning in 2009, it starts to go up and it really spikes in 2015. The violent far left, most of what is represented here are attacks against infrastructure, property damage. It is not lethal attacks. In fact, overwhelmingly, the lethal attacks, meaning people that are hurt or killed, comes from the violent far right. Next slide, please. So, where are we today? We've had this threat with us all along. It's been coming from the violent far right. And I would say it's been about 4 years now, since 2019, the federal government's been pretty persistently consistent that the greatest threat is a lone actor, and we'll talk about that in a second, who radicalized to violence online, look for soft targets with easily accessible weapons. And what this quote doesn't show is that it's primarily the DVE actor, the domestic violent extremist. It's predominantly white supremacists and militia violent extremists. Next slide, please. This slide is comparing the number of people killed by those domestic violent extremist actors versus those that were inspired by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. What you'll notice is, by the way, this is from September 12th, 2001 to September 11th, 2023. So it's almost a 22-year period. More coming from that domestic violent extremist ideology. I think if you had told us in 2005 that more people were going to be killed by white supremacists than ISIS or Al-Qaeda or inspired by them, like we would have been like, no, there's no way that that could be true. Did you see what happened on 9/11? But that's what the data has borne out. We are killing ourselves. It's not an external threat. And remember, those HVE actors are U.S. citizens, or they're usually here legally. They're just inspired by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Next slide. And we're going to go through this really quickly. 5 main categories that the U.S. government uses: racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism. That's where your white supremacist, neo-Nazi, skinhead movements are. That's also where anti-Semitism falls in their categorization. The next broad category is anti-government or anti-authority. there are multiple movements here. You have sovereign citizens, anarchist violent extremism, militia violent extremism, anti-capitalism, anti-institutionalism. Then you have animal rights and environmental violent extremists. They tend to not hurt people. They tend to focus on property damage, infrastructure disruption. Abortion-related violent extremism, and this goes both ways, both pro and anti-abortion, and all other domestic threats, which if you were to look at a graph 5 years ago, the numbers would be kind of small. That other category has ticked up, in part because people's ideologies are increasingly fluid. They aren't as deeply anchored as they used to be 20 years ago, and this is in large part because of the radicalization online. Think about it as 20 years ago, you would have to read something, there was somebody in charge of owning your ideology, like a bin Laden, who was the godfather telling you this is what it means to belong to Al-Qaeda. Now, you can make your own ideology online, and it's much more vibes, which sounds weird. But if you study the people that have committed mass attacks in the last 5 years, including the individual that conducted the attempted assassination attempt against Trump, like the ideology is very loose, if not even there. It's just vibes. It's kind of weird. And for researchers who want to check a box, it gets really uncomfortable because they don't fit the boxes anymore. Next slide. These are the attacks that have occurred from 2010 to 2021. On the far left, you see the racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists. That's the far left category, so they have the most. These are incidents, I should say. The next is agave, that anti-government category. All other domestic threats is in the middle, and then animal rights and abortion-related extremism are on the right. This only goes through 2021. In the last 2 years, we are seeing upticks more in the anti-government space. So I would imagine with updated data that we might exceed the racially motivated category. Next slide. All right, so I've talked about ideological violence. Now there's this other thing that's been happening. You really saw it on January 6th. It existed pre-January 6th. It still exists today, and it's this idea of mass political violence. And there were some studies done by the Chicago Project on Security and Threats in 2021. Here's some of the facts from them. 1 million Americans were a part of or personally knew a member of a militia or extremist group. 1 million. Now, if I told you there are 1 million people from Al-Qaeda here in the country, would we not all panic? I know post 9/11 we would have. Now, 1 in 10 Americans believe the use of force was justified to restore Trump to the presidency. 1 in 3 Americans think violence against the government is sometimes justified. And 25% of Americans say it's sometimes okay to use violence against the government, and 10% say it's okay right now. Now that's from 2021. Last month, the same group, the Chicago Project on Security and Threats, conducted a survey, and we have 17% of the country right now who believe that violence is justified to make sure that their desired outcome for this presidential election occurs. 17%. Next slide. That's 44 million people. Now, before you draw an assumption, this kind of blew some of us out of the water. 10%, the largest of the 17, 10% are wanting to use violence to prevent Trump from becoming president. 7% say violence is justified to make sure Trump becomes president. It's coming from both sides now. That was not the case 5 years ago. But we do have a growing problem of a whole swath of Americans who have come to this place where violence is normalized and acceptable. And I think that's a mission the church can push back on. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about extremism and radicalization. We can go to the next slide. I have to catch up with my notes. So when I rejoined government in 2017, we started having conversations as a counterterrorism community, seeing the 20-year anniversary of 9/11 on the horizon. We were asking ourselves the question, are we winning? And the answer was, of course, we hadn't had another 9/11, so like success there. But we had more terrorists globally in 2017. I think we still do today. But in 2017, when we were doing this analysis, we had more terrorists in 2017 than we had on 9/11. So if you take that original vision that George W. Bush had of a global war on terror, I would say we weren't winning. So we started having some soul-searching conversations, like what is it that we're doing that's actually causing there to be more terrorists? Now, you could have a whole PhD on the mistakes that the US government has made in the prosecution of the war on terror, but we were asking the question more from a perspective of, we don't seem to understand what moves people into this place where they are open to this idea of violence. And it led us to realize that our tools, military intelligence, law enforcement, are insufficient. They're necessary, but they're insufficient for winning this fight. So we knew we needed to change our approach and we needed to move upstream. This brings me to this definition. I'll read it aloud in case you can't see it in the back. The belief, this is the definition of extremism, the belief that an in-group success or survival can never be separated from the need for hostile action against the outgroup. So yes. The belief that an in-group's success or survival can never be separated from the need for hostile action against the outgroup. So we're going to break that down a little bit. In-group, out-group theory, it's been around since the 1970s. It's the way that human beings interact with one another. It's healthy and normal. I mean, who here roots for the Auburn Tigers? That's what my family does, because that's where my husband went to school. Nobody? We have no Auburn Tigers? Okay. All Georgia? All Georgia fans? Okay. War Eagle. No, this is what we do, right? This is why team sports are fun. We find identity in belonging to a group of like-minded people who all know, your team's the best. So that part's normal. Success or survival. We don't usually think about team sports in those terms. I mean, some people get a little crazy, don't get me wrong, but success or survival, and this is one of the things I would love for the church to take a stand on. We probably operate our politics perpetually in the success or survival existential threat realm. So take the hostile action out of it, and it's not extremism. But I want to suggest that the precursor step to extremism is like constantly perceiving a threat from your outgroup. So every politician, now look, they need money and they need your votes. So they're going to try to scare you to do that because fear is a very powerful motivator. It's how you get clicks online. It's how you get eyeballs on TV. Madison Avenue knows it works. So do the political strategists. They're incentivized to constantly keep us fearful. But it's also extremely unhealthy as a society. And it's unhealthy for us as individuals to feel like you're constantly under threat, right? But that's the nature of our politics now. This is the most consequential election of our lifetime. Democracy as we know it's going to end. This is an existential threat. Now, I am concerned about this election. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have some very sobering conversations about where we're headed as a country. But we believe that Jesus has already won the battle. We know how the story ends. We, in a place of darkness of our politics, can be that person that somebody walks up to and says, "Why do you have hope? Don't you see how discouraging, how awful this moment is? But you have hope." And Paul tells us to be quick to be able to answer that question. Why do we have hope? It is not because there's a new nominee for the Democratic National Party. It is not because you think Donald Trump's going to be reelected. Our hope is not in princes or kings or the powers of this world. So, when the powers of this world tell you it's an existential threat, your success or survival is at stake, go back to where our hope is coming from. We can still treat it seriously without taking that next step and going, I'm at threat, or I'm at risk. And we need the church to offer that hope, because the world around us is perpetually in this cycle of success or survival as being threatened. And for some, they get to this place of being very open to the suggestion that the only answer is hostile action. I mean, let's be honest, I grew up in a conservative community. There's only so long, however many decades, I was subjected to messaging of the most consequential election, they're taking away your rights, pastors are going to be thrown in jail for teaching a biblically orthodox scripture. Like, how many messages can you hear before, when they say, therefore you should pray and vote, somebody stands up and says, I don't know, guys, maybe we need to do something more than pray and vote. It's not illogical. And that's what's happened. That's how you end up with statistics like 17% of Americans thinking violence is okay, or a broader survey, not specific to this election, found 32% of Americans, or about 80 million of us, sometimes think violence might be justified. That's how you get there. A couple of other things on extremism. Because of what happened to us on 9/11, and because after every mass shooting, we want to know why. It's like human nature. We want somebody to explain to us why somebody would do something horrific. Why evil? We get really focused on ideology because it kind of quasi-pseudo answers the why question. And the counterterrorism community really focused on ideology too. We have a lot of experts in the nuances of Salafi jihadism or the nuances of the neo-Nazi movement. But here's the thing, we over-indexed on it. We spent way too much time on ideology, and it turns out that ideology is kind of secondary in the radicalization process. Extremism is not, you don't move into extremism because of that ideology. You move into extremism because of underlying unmet psychosocial needs. We'll talk about that more in a second. Extremists leverage crises and uncertainty. They're offering solutions, which justify violence. And they're providing answers to unmet needs. They tend to be very simplistic, black and white answers. Hostile action, what does that mean? The federal government has to focus on the violent aspects of hostile action, so you tend to hear them stay focused on things that are criminally considered, so hate crimes, property damage, terrorism, genocide. That's the upper end of the hostile action spectrum. But those of us in civil society can actually use a broader definition, and hostile action starts not with the violence, it starts on the lower end, bullying, harassment, intimidation, and threats. So when I come back to this definition, the belief that an in-group success or survival can never be separated from the need for hostile action, I actually think that 17% or even that 32% number is quite low, because the number of people that are cognitively open to the idea that I'm just going to go online and yell at somebody or intimidate somebody or bully somebody because of their beliefs is quite high. We know this from other surveys, especially public officials, low-level public officials, your local city council members, your county clerk, are receiving sky-high harassment and abuse. And COVID was a part of the reason why this happened. It kind of broke our norms, and it somehow became permissible to just yell at people because we're mad at the world. But it kind of reminds me of my mother when I was young and my brother and I would do something. She would be like, "Have you lost your ever-loving mind? That's kind of what I want to say to us. Have we lost our ever-loving minds? Like, when did it become okay to treat somebody poorly, especially as believers? Like, you can disagree with people and not have to resort to hostile action, bullying, threats, intimidation, abuse. Now, why does it matter that we have so many people on the lower end of that spectrum? Because radicalization works like a funnel. You can go to the next slide. You have a lot of people that operate at the top of the funnel. They're cognitively open to some of these messages, and it's a smaller and smaller population that actually move to violence or criminal activity. But if you have a lot of people at the top of that funnel, even if it's a small percentage, you're going to have a lot more violence at the bottom. And the more that people participate in that lower end of the hostile action spectrum, that you're creating permission structures for other people to join you. It's an on-ramp. So even though most people are never in a million years actually going to go commit an act of violence or anything criminal, by doing that non-criminal stuff, you're creating the space for somebody else too. This is how we think of radicalization. On the far left, you have people that are vulnerable to it. We'll talk about what those vulnerabilities are. They're not necessarily radicalized. They just, if exposed or the right circumstances happen in their life, might move into that being curious and eventually engaged with extremist ideology. Radicalized, possibly violent individuals, mobilization to violence, and attempted attacks on the far right. The mobilization to violence piece, that's where law enforcement can get engaged. By the time you are mobilizing to violence, you are so far gone in your opening or your ideology of violence that it's very difficult to off-ramp you. What we know about people that are radicalizing is that if you intervene early in the process, you can off-ramp them pretty easily. Because, remember what I said earlier, it's not actually the ideology or the justification of violence that has radicalized them in the first place. It's unmet psychosocial needs. So if you can intervene with somebody in the curious stage and off-ramp them to get them help for those unmet psychosocial needs, you can actually potentially prevent criminal activity. Once they're on that pathway, it's much more difficult to get them off the pathway, and law enforcement action is usually needed. Next slide, please. A couple of other things that we're not going to go into details around how to notice if somebody is on the pathway, but I do want to point out that study after study after study tells us that when we have a lone attacker commit some attack, inevitably, in 83% of cases, somebody knew something was wrong. Loved one, family member, work colleague, peer, something had shifted. Sometimes they actually leave. It's called leakage. Sometimes they actually talk about their plans. 83%. One of the strategies from a governmental perspective to try to reduce violence is to better equip the public with those signs and indicators of somebody that's mobilizing to violence so that a bystander is more likely to raise their hand and say, I'm concerned about this loved one. Can we get them help? And that help might be the form of law enforcement, but that help might also be the form of mental health support. Let's go to the next slide. On this one, and I'm just going to give you the top line so we can get to some of the other topics here. Pre-2010, most people radicalized offline, in person. They might have received an email with, some treatise, a manifesto, propaganda associated with the ideology, but they were not going and seeking it out themselves. They were introduced to somebody sent them something. Post-2010, this completely inverts, and social media becomes the primary way people radicalize. They get introduced to concepts today. It happens where they get introduced to concepts primarily through memes, through jokes, and it creates an opening, and they might go move from a mainstream platform to a more niche platform and eventually a private group. And that's where some of the indoctrination takes place. But there are many niche platforms where various extremist ideologies get discussed. It's constantly changing based on what's happening in real life. So today's version of ideology is not necessarily going to be what it will be in 6 months from now, which I think makes it hard for those of us who are parents or loved ones to keep on top of what the latest narratives are. Next slide. We've talked about some of this already, but some of the reasons why people move to extremism. What we often find in individuals that commit mass attacks as well as those that have just moved into extremist movements is that they've had some sort of crisis in their life, a great sense of uncertainty. It's maybe a loss of a loved one, a loss of a job. It can be just disruption like we all experienced in COVID. So there can be societal disruption, it can be individual disruption, but uncertainty is a key piece of somebody's journey into extremism. The extremists are offering those black and white answers. They're overly certain. And that Overton window shift is a key piece of why we have more people radicalizing today. There are things that 20 years ago, you and your kids would never get exposed to. And now, if you spend any small amount of time online, you are getting exposed to extremist ideas and content, and you probably don't even know it. In fact, most of you with kids, your kids have been exposed, and they don't necessarily know it. I'm not trying to cause panic here, but they have been exposed. So just like we teach in the church that you've got to talk to your kids about drugs and alcohol, you got to talk to your kids about sex, you got to be talking to your kids about extremism too, because they will be exposed to it. Next slide. And just to drive home the point on COVID, a couple of weeks after the stay-at-home directives were issued in April of 2020, the stat is actually from my day job. My company, Moonshot, monitors engagement with online violent extremist content. There was a 37% increase in engagement with extremist content in the weeks after the pandemic started, and within a year, that was a 140% increase. Uncertainty leads people to look for solid, what they perceive to be solid, certain answers, and extremists are really good at making it sound like they have all of the answers. Next slide. Okay, we're going to run through this part real quick, but one of the ways in which extremists work is through disinformation, propaganda, and you can go to the next slide. And I know that this has been a term that has gotten politicized in recent years, but I guess what I want to share with you is that this concept of information warfare has been around for millennia. You can read it in the Old Testament. There are stories of battles that Israel engages with, and their enemies are using information warfare or propaganda or disinformation to try to sow discord, to try to weaken them, to dishearten them. This is how human beings are. It's not new. The modern version of what is called active measures, and this includes disinformation, propaganda, deception, sabotage, destabilization, subversion, and espionage, so all of those things. The modern version mostly is of Russian origin. It was practiced by the czars in the 19th century, and it comes into its own in the 1920s, and it's actually Stalin that coins the term disinformation. He created the Special Disinformation Office in 1923, originally used on his own citizens, and then used externally. Okay, let's take a poll. Has anyone ever heard of these conspiracy theories? John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. were assassinated by the CIA. Okay. Fluorinated drinking water is a plot by the US government to affect population control. Yep, heard that one. We can go to the next slide. This is Kathleen Bailey. She's holding up a paper. She was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. This one was, the AIDS virus was manufactured by US scientists at Fort Detrick to target gay and black people. Anybody heard that one? 1980s? Yep. All of that was planted by the KGB. All of those conspiracy theories. It's not new. She was mad at the press corps because they ran the story without verifying it. Every once in a while, press participates in their own disinformation, I suppose. Next slide, please. Okay, modern. Basically, the KGB took what they had been doing and they put it online, and it's totally cheaper, easier for them to seed, and they're much more successful than they were back in the 1960s. So a couple of examples here. In 2014, a text message was sent out to people living in, it's up there, St. Mary's Parish, Louisiana. And they were being alerted that there was a chemical fire at a plant nearby caused by ISIS, and this went out on September 11, 2014, so it kind of panicked people. And it took local emergency managers, 2 or 3 minutes. They deployed some stuff and realized there's no smoke, there's actually no fire. It was the Russian troll farm, the IRA, Internet Research Agency is what that stands for. They were the ones that sent out the text message. Everybody remember the Ferguson protests, Ferguson, Missouri protests, and you remember that there was a lot of conversation online. Most of that was demonstrated to be inauthentic, meaning it was started by people overseas, not actual Americans. You have Colin Kaepernick. You remember the controversy about taking a knee, Black Lives Matter. Most of the online engagement about that was proven to be inauthentic. So in 2016, we had mostly Russia investing in these measures to influence our elections. It was assessed that they attempted to actually interfere with election systems, like state and local cyber systems. They were unsuccessful at that, but they were able to influence. And in 2020, I think one more slide. In 2020, yes, wasn't just Russia, it was Iran, Lebanese, Hezbollah, Cuba, Venezuela. China considered but did not deploy influence operations. And a big shift in 2020. In 2016, the information was seeded from outside the United States and then amplified inside the United States. In 2020, it flipped. More disinformation was coming from inside the United States, and the outside actors were amplifying it and giving it breathing oxygen to catch fire. So there was a study done that the most popular pages on Facebook for Christian and Black American content were being run by an Eastern European troll farm under the control of Russia. If you spent any time on Facebook, it reached 140 million Americans monthly. You probably ran across one of these pages. The next busiest page is Walmart at 100 million. The largest Christian American page on Facebook is 20 times larger than the next largest, reaches 75 million US users monthly, 95% of whom had never followed any of the pages. It's because of ad technology. It's going to show up on your feed because they're paying for it to show up on your feed. So you're getting exposed to it even if you're being smart and trying to protect yourself from it. Next slide. We're going to skip this slide, but the point there is that you can go to the next slide. It's not just our elections. Disinformation impacts corporations. It impacts private citizens. It is now it's an information warfare. It's been around a long time. The national security community puts out an intelligence assessment every 20 years to kind of talk about the trends coming. And one of the major things that they are concerned about is the role that disinformation will play in the world globally. Next slide. They are, see if this sounds at all relevant to our moment. Now, recognize they're talking about other countries. They're not allowed to assess the United States. They're focusing on the globe. But Insecurity and uncertainty leads to identities and tension and social fragmentation. Next slide. Let's go ahead and skip this slide. Here we go. Why should we care? It's a cycle. As you sow more disinformation, two things happen. One, you might believe it, or some segment of our population believes it, and that has its impact of undermining whoever it's trying to undermine. But the other side of this is that we get information fatigue. We cannot figure out who's telling the truth, what's real, what's not real, so we just go, I'm out. I'm done. And that apathy is a real weakness for a democracy, and our enemies know that. So they are intentionally sowing discord to try to weaken our resolve to push back against them and their evil ways. And I say evil because regardless of what your opinion is on what the United States should do in Ukraine, they started doing this work intentionally to prepare for the invasion that we saw occur in 2022. It was not a mistake that they were trying to weaken us beginning in 2016. This is intentional. So, why should we care? It further exacerbates the problem we already have of distrust in our institutions. It leads to more uncertainty. It leads to anger. It then leads to civil servants receiving all of those threats and harassment I mentioned, and they quit. Our teachers are quitting. Our healthcare workers are quitting. Our election workers are quitting. Why? Why would you put up with death threats from a citizen when you don't make much money in any of those professions? They're hard jobs, and now everybody's mad at you. It's not worth it. So now we have people quitting, and they're taking their experience and expertise with them. So now you're trying to backfill with people with less experience, which means you're less likely to inhibit trust in that institution that they're serving in. All of this leads to a growing sense of despair, nihilism, illiberalism, this openness that, we need somebody strong to just fix everything for us, and it leads to violence. Next slide, please. "77% of election officials have experienced increased threats, death threats that named officials young children. They've been racist threats, gendered threats. They've had to hire personal security. They've fled their homes. They've had to put their kids in counseling. These are election workers, y'all. They have other day jobs. They usually do this on the side. Next slide. So the purpose is to drive a wedge in our pre-existing fractures. The fractures were already there, they're just amplifying them. And they're trying to activate real emotions and exploit and amplify existing societal weakness, often pitting one group against the other. And here's the thing. So much of our efforts on disinformation are focused on, no, let me just fact check for you. Let me get you the right information. And fact checking is important, and we need those resources. But they're exacerbating something deeper. It's an emotional issue. It's a heart problem. Fact checking is not going to solve the heart problem. Next slide. One more slide, please. And I'm going to have you skip that slide too. Next slide. There we go. So what can we do? Faith communities. I promised that I would get you to the good news. You are uniquely suited for this moment. We are. I told you that the reason for people moving towards extremism is unmet psychosocial needs. Those primary unmet psychosocial needs are a need for significance and a need for belonging. Everybody remembers Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and significance or belonging are at the top. I will tell you that in doing research for my book, I read a lot about our isolation, our disconnections, and all of the harms that come from that. It's not just extremism. I think what we're experiencing in terms of the increase in violence since 2015 is just one of many harms that are caused by our communities, our people, our citizenry, increasingly being alone and having a difficult time finding their significance in this world. And I also think those are interconnected. But that's not what our culture says. Our culture says you find significance by defining yourself, by being successful. And you gotta, you can't have too much stuff hinder you, because then you won't achieve that success. Kids are messy, and they take a lot of time and energy and money, and maybe it's just easier if I don't have the kids so that I can achieve whatever. I don't have time to invest in relationships because I've got to finish the next work assignment or the next degree or get that award. And so our culture's message, especially to young people, is that you find your significance through success and that people hold you back. So I think they're interconnected. And the solution, as you all know in this room, is that we actually, what the Bible teaches, we find our significance in serving others. We find our significance in belonging to the Lord. But in belonging to the Lord, that means we're belonging to the body of Christ. You cannot find your significance in a faith relationship solely with Jesus alone. It is Jesus in his body. Our belonging and our significance are uniquely tied together. So one of the things that the church can offer is recovering a biblical model of what and where you find your significance and your belonging for a world that is desperate for it. I mean, so much so that you have atheists now telling us, maybe people should go to church because that, literally might be healthy for you. Better, there are heart conditions. There are, you have higher blood pressure if you were alone. And so, you have doctors and scientists going, we've kind of, made ourselves sick, literally sick, by being so isolated. So maybe you should go back to church. Okay, sure, let's go back to church. That's great. We're going to tell you a few things. Might also change your life. But yeah, if you can get the atheists to go back to church, that's awesome. A couple of other things, just some thoughts for you all to noodle on. And Caleb's going to come up and share from a pastoral perspective how some of this might apply in your communities. But having a nuanced understanding of religion and ideology, you remember how I was talking about extremists offer certainty in an uncertain world? If we can train our people to embrace nuance and to not be afraid of uncertainty, that's very powerful. And I think our faith teaches that. At least the more I grow, the more I just have to be comfortable with the fact that I am a limited human being and God has it. And that it's okay for me not to be in control. Our culture teaches something different. Our culture tells us that we should be in control, and when we run into the reality that we're not in control, it panics us. If we can teach people the grace of not having to have it together, the grace of not being in control, that God is in control, and quite frankly is the only one that could be in control, that builds a protective factor when somebody goes through that period of uncertainty, when they go through the trial and the suffering, that they don't have to go to those extremist answers for solutions, that they have a different way to look at the problem. And that actually brings me to a really, really important thing that I think we've been weak on in the church, in the American church, I should say. We don't do a good job of lament, of grief, and of trials and suffering. If there is one thing that I could recommend to those of you that are in roles of teaching Scripture, developing a holistic theology of suffering is one of the strongest protective factors that you could offer people. Because in this life, we know we will have trouble. And right now, we have a lot of people who have been catechized into this prosperity gospel that life is just going to be easy. And when COVID hit and life wasn't easy, the response was not lament and grief. The response was anger, and I've got to go get control. And it's because we shortchanged. I mean, look, our ancestors 200 years ago were dealing with death on a daily basis. And we are blessed to live in a time and space where we don't have as much suffering as our ancestors did. So we need to find ways to come alongside those who are suffering for our own benefit so that we can watch God work in that suffering. We're shortchanging our maturity if we're not walking alongside those that are suffering. Let's go to the next slide. These are some recommendations on what the communities can do to counter disinformation and polarization. And I will not walk through all of them because I want to see if anybody has questions. But what I will commit to do is sending you guys the slides, and there are speaker notes in here. So you're more than welcome to take advantage of that. And I know some of my colleagues that are going to be speaking today are going to go into more depth on how to have healthy disagreement, how to push back against and protect ourselves against disinformation. So I'll leave it to those experts to share their expertise. Can I see if there's any questions? We have just a few minutes.
Hi, can you hear me? I think I got the connection, or I almost got, but if you could explain the connection between disinformation and death threats. I missed how those dots happen.
Sure, thank you.
And I don't think you were saying that the death threats come straight from the Russians, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, no, so the disinformation, this is information that's untrue or inauthentic, meaning we have people who pretend to be Susie from Coral Gables, Florida. I'm really upset that Colin Kaepernick took the knee, and then Joe from someplace else going, but I think he had every right to take the knee. And Joe and Susie aren't real. They're Russians sitting in Estonia, not Estonia, a place near Russia, I can't remember where it is. And they are just, taking on different personas and pretending to be angry. And then you go online and see this fight and you kind of, well, I think Susie's right. And so it's influencing you, or it's creating this perception that, man, everybody's just angry. And what happens to most people, and we have data to show us this, is when people get angry, like when there's a lot of anger, like our tendency is just to be like, I'm just gonna stand back here. Like, you guys have your fight, like that seems really intense for you, good for you, I'm not gonna engage. And so what the Russians have just done is gotten people to step back and not participate in our civil society. So it has two impacts. It could make you more angry, or it could make you step back. And both of those are helpful to their aims. So the person that gets riled up and angry over that then is starting to participate in a constant outrage cycle and becomes more open to messages that we need to do something about whatever the issue is. So around the 2020 election, with the Stop the Steal movement, lots of conversations were happening, probably authentic conversations that the Russians may have amplified. It didn't start externally, it was definitely an internal movement. And from that, they had people make suggestions that you should go and tell those election workers, give them a piece of your mind. And so you ended up with people participating in that grievance cycle who were then already in a hostile action space cognitively, and some of them actually went and made those threats. So it's more about the environment that disinformation creates that then allows people to be more open to doing that harassing behavior. Does that help?
Thank you so much for the presentation. Two quick questions. The first one is, how would you suggest we interpret the findings of the research in terms of time period? So if you think through how you've helped us to see different trends, how far back would you say it'd be safe to look at that in terms of reading American landscape about extremism?
Yeah.
And then the second question is the psychosocial unmet needs. Would material needs also be in that, or what does your research should suggest about material needs?
Great,
Thank you so much.
That's a great question. Can I ask you to go to slide 47 too, just to put up some key takeaways? The psychosocial needs, so the social part of that, it is tied to sometimes people who don't have a job. We've had, my company we work with to identify or reach people who are engaging with that harmful content online and offering them to mental health support. And we have a story of an individual who was engaging with very harmful content, and we later learned was planning a vehicle ramming attack. This was up in Canada. And they initially presented to the counselor as needing a home. There were housing insecure. They had just been kicked out of their girlfriend's home. And what appears to have been the trigger was getting kicked out of the home, and then he was really angry, starting to plan this vehicle ramming attack, runs across her ad, gets connected to a counselor, and they were advertising in Canada, we can help you connect you with housing. And so he reached out, and that opened the door for them to actually have a longer conversation, and 6 months later you find out what's really going on. So there is absolutely a connection to unmet material needs and people's grievances that then can lead them to that opening where they might think that violence is the solution. And I actually forgot your first question, and I'm sorry. Is it okay?
You mentioned about lament as churches responding in a more healthy way. I remember I was in my third year when 9/11 hit, and I couldn't imagine how many people were in worship that following Sunday. It was just overwhelming, but the very next Sunday, it was almost like we realized we didn't do it right. Mm-hmm. We didn't respond in a way, and maybe we didn't have the knowledge or history to deal with something that severe. But I noticed that it was almost like we failed our congregations back that far. How do we make sure we don't do that again?
Oh, I don't know. I think that's what you guys are here to figure out. And I don't say that flippantly. I think, and now I remember the other gentleman's question about history. We are people that don't remember what happened 2 years ago, let alone 200 years ago. And there's absolutely a need to go back and remember the saints that have gone before us and to glean from them wisdom of walking through difficult moments. Sir, you had asked how far back. My research that I'm using is based on the data that we have available, which really starts in the early 1990s. There are historians that do cover waves of terrorism from the 1960s. Anarchist violent extremists are kind of the first modern terrorists, and that starts with assassination attempts back in the early 1900s. So there's some interesting stuff there, but we just didn't have data collection back then. So some of what we're seeing in terms of trends is just limited by the actual data we have, and where you don't have data, you can rely on history to go back and better understand, how cultures and citizenry have dealt with these challenges in the past. But I would say the lament thing, I think, is not. It's like a Western culture problem, right? I mean, if you spend any time in any other culture, it always shocks me how much richer some of their faith is because because they're not burdened by the Western individualistic mindset. Like the fact that we're not very communal as a people is deeply harmful to the faith and to our ability to endure suffering and trials. So there's a lot that we should be gleaning from other parts of the church around the globe, as well as our history, would be my encouragement. But I'm certainly open to the ideas that you all in this room will come up with.
All right, so we have one more question, and then we'll take a short break before the next speaker.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It has been extremely generative, and I think many of us are just sitting here trying to wrap our heads around the information, right? But my question is that there are so many politicians in this day and age who use their platforms as a bully pulpit. And there's a good amount of information about what we should do as pastors and theologians and so on and so forth. But could you talk a little bit about what the government is doing to kind of put some, I don't know, some brackets around some of the things that are being said within the political realm?
Yeah, so there's, in a different forum, I could give you another full hour lecture on all of the things the government should be doing in the prevention space, and I actually cover it in my book if you're interested. There are some policy solutions, there are things that the feds should do, things that the states should do, things that local governments should do, and all of that is important. I think the nature of the question you're asking, though, is the culpability and the role that they are playing in creating the toxic soup that we're swimming in. And what I often try to impress on people is that it is easy to radicalize en masse, meaning at a national level through various mechanisms, whether it's media, social media, or influencers. You can move people quickly to a place where they're cognitively open to violence. Now, they might not necessarily take that next step, but we saw on January 6th what happened. It doesn't take much, and you get a group of people together, and you get a few organized groups. There were violent extremists in their midst with plans, and because they had those plans and they broke through the lines, other people followed, right? Most of the people there were not a part of an organized extremist movement. So it is easy to radicalize en masse. It is impossible to de-radicalize en masse. De-radicalization requires one-on-one engagement. It requires usually mental health counseling or pastoral counseling, work of the Lord, quite frankly, because it's a heart change thing. And so it's really easy to poison hearts at scale. It is really hard to undo that work at scale in a national context. So part of the reason I think churches are part of the solution is that churches are inherently local. You're in the community. You're working with individuals. And that's where the heart change needs to happen, is one-on-one in relationship. But I would love for them to stop saying stupid stuff. That would be very helpful. They would all behave. Thank you all very much.
All right, let's all thank Elizabeth.